Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton. I'm joined by co-host Craig Truglia and also guest Dr. Adam J. DeVille. Dr. Adam, it's great to have you. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. So before I dive into some of the theological questions, I was just curious, are you a Catholic or were you a convert to Catholicism or are you a cradle Catholic?
I grew up in the Anglican Church of Canada and in the late 1990s entered the Catholic Church in 1997.
Okay, what part of Anglicanism? Was it ACNA or the Episcopal Church?
It was the Anglican Church of Canada, which at that time was kind of the only Anglican show around. There were new sort of movements breaking off from that, but it was kind of the mainstream so-called church in communion with Canterbury and the American Episcopal Church and so on.
Okay, was it kind of more the liberal leaning bent, or?
It was headed in that direction very clearly by the time I left in 97. It was the direction was pretty much set, I think, at that point.
Yeah. What kind of pushed you towards Roman Catholicism, or actually Eastern Catholicism?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because if you read the documents of the bilateral dialogues between the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches going all the way back to the 1970s, the Anglicans in there concede at every point that there needs to be a common teaching authority in the church, and that they themselves admit that the only credible such authority is the Bishop of Rome. So I just kind of followed the logic, as it were, of what was already being argued by Anglicans in these dialogues, and said, I think there are serious flaws in what's being taught today within Anglicanism, and the clarity that the Catholic Church offers. This is just 5 years out from the new Universal Catechism of '92. Is a very welcome thing in an age which seems to be getting ever more confused.
Yeah. Okay. So did you join through the Latin Rite, or did you go straight into Eastern Catholicism?
Yeah, I joined the Latin Church in '97, and then when I spent a summer in 2001 teaching in Ukraine, really sort of fell in love with the Eastern Catholic tradition in general, and the Ukrainian Catholic tradition in particular, and I've been a part of the Ukrainian Catholic Church ever since.
Yeah. Well, maybe speak to what are the differences between the Latin Rite and the Eastern Catholic churches? What exactly is Eastern Catholicism?
Well, it's often been described as kind of the best kept secret in the Catholic Church. It's easily dwarfed. I mean, we're looking at 1.5 billion Catholics in the world, and maybe 20 million of them are Eastern Catholics in a variety of churches, Armenian, Coptic, Melkite, Romanian, Ukrainian, and so on. So they're not well known, and they're generally quite small and often hidden. The big difference is people notice walking in the door. The architecture of a church, for example, is quite different. Churches of the Byzantine tradition, have icons and iconostas and so on. Liturgically, of course, there are significant differences. The other one that almost always occasions a nod of recognition is the fact that the Eastern Catholic churches have maintained, by and large, a married priesthood. And those are the ones that people often sort of gravitate towards as kind of the really obvious differences that you would commonly encounter on a weekly basis.
Okay. Well, I was reading some of your material a while back when I was at Christendom, and I was working on a paper that was dealing with the issues of Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, and it was focusing on the differences. And so, of course, I was addressing the papacy and the Filioque. But as I was going through different works on the papacy, I came across, I believe it was your doctoral work, which I think you later republished under the title Orthodoxy and the Roman Papacy.
Right.
And I was going through the first part, and it was talking about the different modern Eastern Orthodox views of the Roman papacy. And it seems that you had, come to a conclusion that there is somewhat of a consensus in Eastern Orthodoxy on the papacy. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit? What exactly would you say in your studies that you've discovered would be the consensus, the modern consensus from the Eastern Orthodox on the papacy?
Yeah, the first part of the book does kind of sum up all the literature in the 20th and early 21st centuries. I think there's a consensus, first of all, that there needs to be a primate, and that, certainly in terms of all major Orthodox scholars of our time, is pretty widely conceded, that Orthodoxy has a real problem insofar as the question of primacy is concerned. And so, major Orthodox theologians have said, yeah, primacy has to be part of the church if we are serious about being at the same time a conciliar or a synodal church. In other words, Metropolitan John Zazoulas, who's probably the greatest Greek theologian alive today, has said, you want to talk about a synodal or a conciliar church, it makes no sense unless you simultaneously talk about having a primate. Primacy and conciliarity have to go together. And he concedes, and others like Andrew Louth concede that, we are suffering within the Orthodox world by not having a consensus about a primate. So you need to have a primate in the first place. Then it gets a little more complicated as to what that primate looks like and what actual power it has.
Yeah. Now, in Eastern Orthodoxy, wouldn't that primate be the Patriarch of Constantinople?
Well, that's a debate the Orthodox themselves have not come to a common mind on. The theory developed that Constantinople was, as kind of the second see within the so-called patriarchal taxis, entitled to be that kind of primate. But there's not a consensus on what exactly that means in concrete terms. And in fact, there's a fairly well-known controversy over whether the ecumenical patriarch still has the right to claim any sort of primacy, given that his church has dwindled to such tiny numbers, after the First World War and the population settlements of the 1920s. So what you get then is this kind of attempt to kind of muscle him aside a little bit by the much larger Russian church, and these theories among some Russian Orthodox that the Patriarch of Moscow really should be the primate within the Orthodox world because he's the head of the largest church. So it's not a question that Orthodoxy itself has totally achieved a consensus on.
But for the most part, they're all in agreement that the Pope mainly had his position through political reasons, and those reasons have been lost due to the fact that he is, of course, in their perspective, in heresy. Is that correct?
Well, part of it, part of the way these cities develop in the early church is simply by following the dominant structures of the Roman Empire. And so, in some ways, the Bishop of Rome is primate because he's the bishop of the capital city. Once the capital shifts under Constantine in 330 to Constantinople, then this theory develops that, well, Constantinople is the new Rome, and therefore should be, if not exactly number one now, then certainly, a very highly placed number two. And so a lot of this follows the patterns of the empire. Later on, we ascribe, theological and historical reasons. We start coming up with theories of apostolicity, for example, to buttress claims to primacy. But certainly very early on, it was really, what are the large cities of the empire? And that's how we wind up with not just Rome, but Alexandria and Antioch, and then, Constantinople and Jerusalem tacked on.
But now that, there is no longer an empire, that's kind of why, Moscow is a little more favorable.
Yeah, I mean, when Constantinople fell in 1453, the theory quickly developed in certain East Slavic circles that this was God's doing, and he was now sort of sending the primacy north, as it were. And it was the task of the Russians to pick this up. And so you get these theories of the so-called Third Rome, which, Old and New Rome have now fallen. And so the one remaining Rome is Moscow. Now that's a pretty rarefied theory, shall we say, that not even all Russians accept, but it does come along as a way of saying, okay, if you're going to base this on questions of political clout, and imperial status. Well, you guys no longer have an empire. We're in the process of building one, so maybe we should be primate.
Okay. Now, tell me a little bit more about the rest of the book, Orthodoxy and the Roman Papacy, and also maybe why you felt the need to write this.
Well, the book was really responding to a request, I think quite sincere, that was made by Pope John Paul II in 1995. He writes this letter on Christian unity, Od Unum Sint, and he actually says in there, paragraphs 94, 95, he extends an open invitation to other Christians to help him think of sort of a new configuration for the papal office so that it could again be an instrument of unity rather than division. And when I started writing the dissertation in 02, 03, we had very few Orthodox responses to that. And so that was what I said I was doing the first part of the book, was cull those and bring those together. The rest of the book then was to sort of say, okay, here's what the broad consensus looks like. What then would need to change within the papacy for it to be acceptable to the Orthodox again? And so in the later chapters of the book, I lay out a proposal for moving towards a model of governance that allows the papacy to retain certain primatial powers, but exercise those in a way that draws in the other heads of the Eastern churches in a kind of a permanent ecumenical synod, so that it's not a monarchical governance anymore, but it's a governance by sort of the Patriarchy and synod model that is commonly found in most of the Eastern churches.
So you would say essentially that's the change that the papacy would need to make, that it would become more synodal. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then there'd be a lot of practical implications you'd have to work out from that. Because the other thing that's quite interesting, and John Paul did this as well, was talk about looking to the first millennium for models. And if we do that seriously, I think there are problems in doing that, but if we do that seriously, then we realize in the first millennium, we didn't have, for example, a bureaucracy in Rome telling bishops around the world what to do, and providing them with sort of ready-made translations of liturgical texts, for example. And so I said, if we're serious about the papacy and orthodoxy, we have to realize that a lot of the modern sort of bureaucratic apparatus of the papacy is not going to be welcomed by the East, and we need to find different ways of looking to structure the church. And so having a synod on a regular basis to make decisions rather than having officials in the Roman Curia seems to be a way that the Orthodox would find acceptable.
Now, how exactly would that work for the Roman Catholic side? Because, of course, Vatican I has dogmatized the position that the powers of the Pope are immediate and ordinary. And so how does synodality, factor into that?
Well, and that's really the big question and the big challenge. The way I approach it is to say that there's nothing in Vatican I that prohibits the Pope from moving towards a new model. Decrees of most councils, leaving aside Vatican II, up until Vatican I, decrees of most councils are, I think, wonderfully spare in their language. And that allows, it seems to me, the church room to be able to consider changes from time to time. And so I don't think that you can talk about what does universal jurisdiction mean, for example. It's nowhere laid out in Pastor Eternus. The closest we come to fleshing out what that might mean is in the codes of canon law, starting in 1917. So canonical expression to conciliar decrees is something that I think allows the church a certain flexibility in how it understands what those decrees look like in practical terms. So I don't see that Vatican I prohibits the papacy from moving in a more synodal direction. You can argue whether that's a good idea or not, but I don't think Pastor Eternus is necessarily the roadblock that at first blush it's sometimes thought to be.
Well, maybe in practice, there could be more synodality, but wouldn't Eastern Orthodox have to accept Vatican I as dogmatic in theory? Wouldn't they have to give their, divine and Catholic faith to that teaching?
Well, and that's an interesting question in itself. I was just talking with somebody last night about this. What do we do with the councils, whether you go back before or after Florence? The West has started enumerating these councils as ecumenical. What do we do with that if we're looking at unity with the East or with Protestantism in some form? I don't think there can be or should be any waffling on the first seven up until Nicaea II in 787. Beyond that, I think that's a question that hasn't really been considered. Pope Paul VI, in a rather offhanded comment around 1973, I think it was, voiced the theory that it would be possible to think of everything after Nicaea II as a kind of a general council of the Western Church, and not necessarily ecumenical until and unless other Christians agreed to it. But I think, as I say, I think that's an open question, and that's a problem. What do we do that? It's curious to me that if you're looking just at Vatican I, most Orthodox don't find it theologically problematic to envision the papacy teaching infallibly. The bigger sticking point is the notion of jurisdiction. But because that term has not been clearly defined, it seems to me there's, as I say, kind of room to maneuver here.
Okay. Craig, let me give you a chance to jump in before I ask any more questions. Did you have any questions?
Yeah, I'd just make the comment where I would think most Orthodox actually would not take it as a non-issue. It's a double negative, but with the issue that the Pope being infallible, I think that'd be a major pill for Orthodox to swallow, especially the direction apologetics have taken in the last couple centuries. Probably, I'd say, again, the issue is jurisdiction, because that was really the issue that was always under debate. Because even the issue of infallibility, I don't think was really something that came up in Florence. I think it was off everyone's radar.
Yeah, no, it really depends on 19th century epistemic theories, or late 18th century. It wasn't at Florence. Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting there's a wide consensus and people are jumping up and down, eager to embrace Vatican I. But you do find some. I mean, Dumitru Staniloae, for example, in Romania, who looked at the terms of how infallibility is defined and said, well, yeah, we could probably live with that. It's not an enthusiastic embrace of it, but I think part of the real problem here is not just what the text of Pastor Aeternus says. I think perhaps the bigger problem is how that's been interpreted, and how that's entered into in what my newest book calls the Catholic imaginary, and taken in a very expansive and maximalist direction. You mentioned apologetics. I think apologetics on the papacy in many cases has done great damage. I don't think it's been very helpful, in part because it kind of tends to play up the role of the Pope in a way that I don't think, as I say, is helpful, and I don't think it's even faithful to what Vatican I intended.
Now, as a follow-up, because your research for your dissertation was in the 1990s, I presume that a lot of Orthodox scholarship would have been very shifted west in Greece, just to the fact that, I mean, the Soviet bloc just collapsed and they would have been outside of that. Has there been major shifts in Orthodox scholarship, particularly after the late 1990s?
The shift that I noticed, so I'm writing. I went back really to Vatican I and looked at everything up until about 2008 when I finished the dissertation, published as a book in 2011. There is a shift with the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91. There's no doubt about that. And it's a negative shift in some ways. I quote, for example, John Erickson, who reported a conversation with some of his students at St. Vladimir's Seminary in New York, to the effect that, when the Soviet Union existed, we had to be ecumenical. Now we can be Orthodox. And the import of that was, screw this ecumenism stuff. We had that shoved down our throats by, in some cases, KGB minders to prove to the West that there was so-called religious freedom in the Soviet Union. We're not playing that game anymore. And so there was something of a shift there that made the whole concept of ecumenical dialogue much less palatable to some people, especially in the Slavic world.
Well, let me ask a couple questions on behalf of Eric. He wasn't able to make it here tonight, but he sent me a few questions. He asks, what are the origins of the Western papal over-centralization in your view?
I think it's a long process. Vatican I doesn't arrive out of nowhere. In some ways, I think you really have to go back to the beginning of the second millennium. A lot of this gets major impetus under Gregory VII at the end of the 11th century, 1073 to 85, I think are his dates. And Gregory really wants to expand the powers of the papacy because he's got to fight with Henry IV, the emperor. And there's a lot of corruption in the Western Church at that point, with the sale of offices, parishes, and even bishoprics. He seems to think that the way to kind of smash through all of this is by his having this kind of supranational authority that can tell not just other bishops what to do, but can even depose emperors, as he attempts to do with Henry. So I think papal centralization comes along in some cases as a reaction to political developments in the Western world. In the 11th century, that's very clear, but I think it's also very clear in the West in the 18th and 19th centuries. Vatican I, to my mind, is absolutely impossible to understand until you get your head around the French Revolution. Vatican I think, is nothing other than a reaction to the French Revolution and all that was unleashed by that.
How so? Just curious.
Well, if you look at the damage done by the revolution to the church in France, it's pretty staggering. And I think the church is coming out of that is just shattered. And it continues, even under Napoleon. Napoleon comes along in 1800 and basically decides that he is going to sack the entire French episcopate. So all the bishops are gone. He's going to recreate the diocesan boundaries himself to reduce them dramatically. And then he's going to go out and find bishops who are willing to do what he wants. And he presents all this to the Pope at the time and says, either you do it or I'm going to do it. And so Pius VII realizes he's kind of over a barrel, but he's going to go ahead and do this anyway, because to his mind, with Gregory VII in the background, it's always better for the popes to do something than to have the emperor attempt to impose his will. And so, the revolution, I think, gives rise to this idea that popes can have really extraordinary powers. I understand. I sympathize with what Pius does in the same way I sympathize with Gregory VII. But I think, the problem is you get what I often call the law of unintended consequences, which with the papacy really kicks in down the road. And so what's really an emergency situation in France in 1800, 1801, then suddenly appears to people at Vatican I as being something we could maybe regularize and normalize and institutionalize as a constant feature of papal power. It wasn't, I don't think, supposed to be that way. An emergency situation makes for bad law, it makes for bad theology. But that's kind of the context in which Vatican I gathers.
Now, if I could piggyback on that for Eric's second question, then would that, to kind of backtrack then how that led to Vatican I, if we're to backtrack from Vatican I and this, extreme manifestation of, those contemporary necessities, Would that essentially require us reducing the way we interpret Vatican I to being really, like you said, like a Western synod, almost like a local council?
I really think that that's got to be a serious part of the conversation. That this is a council that is not called to deal with any real dogmatic threat. And I think Vatican I is regrettable in the sense that it violates the rule, which I think it was Cardinal Newman who first articulated when he said that nothing is defined until it's denied. And there's no major denials going on in the 19th century, that we need this. It's a pretty brazen show of what Pius IX could do and wanted to do as a kind of an in-your-face gesture to not just Napoleon, but the whole Second Empire, and even all the way back again to the Revolution. I think, and I think we have evidence of this in looking what he does in 1854, when he unilaterally declares the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Even Roman Catholic apologists for that dogma that I've read have said, they've been kind of forced to admit there was no need for this. Right? There's no pressing denial of Marian doctrine in the 19th century. This has nothing to do with Mary or Jesus, for that matter. This has everything to do with the Pope, who sees the writing on the wall in many ways. He knows that his territories are being gobbled up and are soon to disappear. He's got to find a new role for himself on the world stage because, within a decade and a half, he's no longer going to be a monarch in Western Europe with territories and an army and a navy. He's just going to be this guy stuck in the central Italian peninsula. He's got to find a new role, and the new role is what people like Owen Chadwick call teacher of the nations, and I think that explains Immaculate Conception, and it certainly explains Vatican I. It seems to me.
Now, you mentioned Cardinal Newman. Did he have an impact on your faith and theology?
Newman's a wonderful figure, and nobody coming out of Anglicanism into the Catholic Church, I think, can avoid reading Newman. I picked up a copy of the Apologia in the summer of '96, and I left it on my chair for a week or more because I remember very clearly saying to myself, "That's a very dangerous book for me to read right now." Because I knew what it would probably end with, and it did. I mean, it ended with me becoming Catholic. I say to my students, some of whom aren't Catholic, I say, you got to read the guy, even if you don't, become Catholic or agree with him, because he is the paramount figure, I think, of 19th century Catholicism. But he's also just a beautiful writer. His prose is so magnificent. If you read him for no other reason than that, read him to just kind of savor this wonderful stylist and man of English letters.
Okay. Now, we were speaking about earlier, the West having this issue of over-centralization. Eric also asks, has the East ever fallen victim to that?
That's a really interesting question. And one of the things I try to look at in the book is the fact that that's really a temptation that the East has fallen into. Some people would say that the current structures of the ecumenical patriarchate today are very centralized, and I would agree with that. They just appointed a new primate for the United States here, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, and there was zero input from the local church.
Yeah,
which if you want is a very papal move.
Right.
The other big example is if you look at the statutes, and I do this again in the book, of the Russian Church in 1945. The Russian Church is very useful to Stalin in the Great Patriotic War, as World War II is still known today in Russia. And as a result of the services rendered by the Church, Stalin agrees to allow some of the forcibly closed churches in Russia to reopen, and a patriarch to be picked to head the Church, provided that the statutes of the Church are rewritten, so that Stalin doesn't have to worry about any bishops going rogue. He just has to lean on the patriarch, who will keep everybody in line. And so what you find in the 1945 statutes of the Russian Church, is centralization beyond even what the papacy had at the time. the patriarch was entitled even to be basically appointing parish clergy if he wanted to, down to that kind of fine detail. And so, yes, centralization is not a phenomenon that's confined to the West. You do find it cropping up in the East at different periods and in different churches. Now, the Russian church today is reformed its statute. It's not that centralized anymore, but it's still pretty centralized.
Right. Yeah. Well, what do you think about the Filioque and issues like Palinism and Aquinas? Do you think that those are really church dividing topics? Or are those things that really need to be reconciled before there's reunion? Or are these issues that Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics can agree to disagree on?
On Palinism, I'm waiting on a new book from Oxford University Press. I was just talking to them yesterday. Norman Russell, who's a very important and significant Orthodox scholar, has got a new book coming out about Palamas, and basically his thesis, from what I can tell, is Palamas has been one of these figures that have been kind of invented in the last number of years for often apologetic purposes, with all of the kind of exaggerations and misrepresentations that goes with. So I think that's going to be an interesting book to see what comes out. As for remind me again the first part of your question.
The Filioque.
Filioque, thank you. Yeah, I really think the 2003 statement of the North American Orthodox Catholic Dialogue, which has been widely translated and I think taken up by a lot of people, settles the question. The Filioque, to my mind, is a non-issue. I think that statement does a really good job of saying, here's how Catholics can understand what happened and what the Orthodox view is, and here's how Orthodox can understand what happened and what the view is. With a little goodwill, I think, on both sides, I think we can say, let's put this to bed. I would, however, go a bit beyond that and say we need maybe some extra good faith on the Catholic side to do what apparently John Paul was prepared to do in 1995, which is direct that the Filioque be taken out of liturgical usage in the Latin Church. And I asked about that in 2010 when the Church in the United States was preparing for a new translation of the Roman Missal. I said, a good translation practice requires that you go back to the source text. You never translate from a translation. I mean, that's just a bad practice. So I said, why don't you go back and translate the creed from the original, which of course is the Greek with no Filioque in it. But that was something that they weren't prepared to consider. But I don't see why that couldn't be done at any point, really, by the Catholic Church as a way of saying, we need to be completely united around this common, what we call a common symbol of faith. Let it truly be common by going back to the text as we agreed to it at the first two councils.
Okay.
Now, if I could interject on that topic, wouldn't the main impediment to doing just that would be that the Filioque was quoted in Greek in the Council of Florence, and the Uniate churches have had until I think the 20th century, say the Filioque in their respective languages, and so that kind of gets rid of the whole the apologetic and these ecumenical dialogues. Said, well, in the Latin it's legitimate, and I think there's an agreement, but then the issue would be then the Western Church was in error, and then imposing it in the Greek, where now we're arguing it's not heretical in Latin, but it's heretical in Greek. So again, it would seem like the only way to make sense of that would be to say that, well, those were local Western councils and weren't ecumenical in authority. I mean, what's your comments on that?
Yeah, I think we're in agreement. If it's an issue we're going to move past, then I think the Catholic Church has to make clear that this is removed from all liturgical usage. Certainly, I mean, even within my own lifetime, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic hierarchs of North America have made that switch, and I don't know of any parishes today, at least on this continent, where it's still recited. And I think that's true across the board for other Eastern Catholic churches. So it seems to me it is just the Latin Church that's kind of still the holdout here. But I think there are ways of saying that the Filioque, whether it's at Florence or before or after, is something that served a purpose for a time. It seems to, I mean, I think the case is pretty convincing that, the Spanish bishops of the 6th century, 5th century thought this was a legitimate way of dealing with Arianism. But we don't live in that period anymore. Crisis is past, we can take the Band-Aid off kind of thing. Let's do that. I have to think also, quite frankly, that most people wouldn't even notice. I mean, the change was made when I was still an Anglican, because the Anglican Orthodox dialogue had agreed to this even before the Catholic dialogue. And so it was changed when I was a kid in the 80s in Anglican liturgies, and people didn't notice. And there was no protest or anything that at least that I recall.
Now, the follow-up on your comment about Palamas being an invented figure, I presume what you mean by that is what he's been made to represent. I mean,
right.
Palamas would be just as comfortable with logic and syllogisms than the scholastics.
Yeah.
And so he's been kind of built into this figure that's to be the antithesis of this, perhaps somewhat artificially. So my comment would be, why do you think that is? Do you think it's like the influence of Vladimir Lasky? I mean, what happens in popular Orthodox dialogue after the fall of Imperial Russia, where there's been this distancing from positions? There was almost, I would say, a lot of theological rapprochement before East and West before then.
Yeah, Palamas is a really interesting figure. I think he's kind of a cipher in some ways on both sides. I mean, if you look at what Martin Jougy does with him on the Catholic side, it's a disgrace. Jougy beats Palamas up for things that Palamas never believed as a kind of way of sticking it to Orthodoxy. On the other side, some people use Palamas as kind of elevating him into this sort of paradigmatic figure of everything that's true in the East that the West is either lacking or has somehow messed up. I think people like Scott Kenworthy, for example, who's written some really interesting books on contemporary Russian Orthodoxy and 20th century Orthodox history. He said that Palamas is a figure that is still pretty marginal, even within contemporary Russian Orthodox circles. He seems to have been picked up more in the West than elsewhere. But I think for whatever reason, human beings, I think we like to have these figures onto whom we project all sorts of ideas that have, at best, loose connection to what they actually believed. We do this with Augustine. We've done this with Aquinas. Mark of Ephesus, I think, is another clear figure. Mm-hmm. We want to have people behind whom we can rally, sort of holding the banner for our side. On the Catholic side, people have often done that with Thomas. I got into a debate a couple of weeks ago with Roman Catholic theologian who thought that merely by quoting Thomas at me, that just settled all the whole question. And I had to say to him, look, he's one theologian in the Western tradition. He's not the only one. But I think, these figures often become, as I say, used and abused for other reasons. By the way, the other, I think, really important person here to mention is Marcus Plested, Orthodox scholar at Marquette. And his work on Palamas has been deeply interesting.
Yeah, from what I could tell in watching some of his lectures, he shows how there was a lot of interest in the East with Thomas Aquinas. Oh, yeah. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's the fascinating part of his book, to my mind, was again, here we think that Thomas is portrayed as the figure of Latin scholasticism. And of course, everybody thinks scholasticism is a terrible idea. And so, if we rubbish Thomas, then we're rubbishing the whole scholastic tradition. But again, to read Thomas, and I don't claim to have read much of him at all, but what I have read, it's very clear he's profoundly indebted to the Greek fathers. Some of the numbers I've seen, he quotes the Greek fathers even more than Augustine. So it really kind of behooves the point. It sounds like a kind of a, the typical point an academic would make, but I think it's important. Go and read the originals, go back to these sources, Augustine, Aquinas, Palamas, all these people and read them, because I have yet to find a figure who is not much more careful than he is portrayed as being. And people get very careless with these people and start using them to buttress positions they've already arrived at, even if the figure in question is not necessarily so fully supportive.
Okay, let's go to a couple questions from the chat, if that's okay. Ian asked, Dr. DeVille, do you know anything about the project of a Polish nobleman of the Greek religion? It was a proposal for union with Rome by St. Peter Moya, which unfortunately is not in English. If so, do you think his proposal of dual communion was or is a viable option today for the Ruthenian Ukrainian Church?
I can't say I know anything about that, so I wouldn't say an answer.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that either.
I have a comment on it.
Yeah.
If I remember right, and I do think there are some sections in English, I don't know about the entirety, but I remember reading what I thought was it, or perhaps sections of it. And essentially, what the compromise he was thinking of was no papal supremacy, let us have our liturgical rights, don't have the Filioque, and that's about it. There was also an interesting comment in the document where he called Moscow barbarian, because you have to remember Kiev was the cradle of Slavic civilization for the Rus. And so Moscow is this kind of latecomer with this sort of pretense. So it's interesting that sort of provincial attitude came out in that document.
Okay, yeah, I haven't heard of that before. Max asks, if the papacy is necessary for the safeguarding of sacred tradition, then how have the Orthodox remained faithful for a millennium without it? It's weird because even Pope Benedict XVI admits to this.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, that evidence does rather strongly relativize the claim that, you have to be in communion with the Pope or else, you're going to have this kind of doctrinal chaos, or you're going to have, imperil your salvation. It seems to me that I don't think Catholicism is entirely consistent on this point, because you hear that expressed on the one hand, but on the other hand, Rome very clearly and carefully calls the Orthodox churches, which it calls nobody else, and that means that they have everything necessary unto salvation. And so it seems to me there's a bit of an inconsistency here. You've got to be in communion with the Pope. Look at what something like Boniface VIII said to that effect. No, the Orthodox, I think, for different reasons, have done, in some cases, a much better job, I would say, of preserving really important things than the West has. And I think that does really force you to consider this argument that the papacy is necessary to keep things from falling apart. I think that's a pretty hard claim to reconcile with the evidence.
And I'd like to piggyback on that. It's a two-way street, because let's say if you take the Orthodox vantage point, the West is in schism, they're cut off from the tree. It's amazing where clearly the totally different culture of the West, the theological language, just the way the catechism is set up. And yet it really isn't distant from Orthodox doctrine, quite frankly. And we've seen, if anything, what comes to purgatory and a lot of these things, where a lot of the extreme things that caused the Protestant Reformation have sort of came back in the 20th century. How is it cut off for, since the Crusades? So let's say 800 years, at least since Florence, that the Roman Catholic Church has held it together with, I would say, much more intellectual people within, Western intellectual history. Yes, the Enlightenment came to Russia and whatnot, but it wasn't like, look, you just said the French Revolution. It literally tore apart, like, the core of the Roman Catholic Church. It really was Italy, Rome's in Italy, but France was where it was at for Roman Catholicism. So it's, I think, luck, grace of God, there's a lot of different things you could say.
Yeah, there are, absolutely. Yep, that's right.
James from the chat asks, why should the Roman Church remove the Filioque? That seems to indicate that it's an admission that the Filioque is heretical.
I think if you go back and read the document that came out of Rome in 1995, it tackles that question, it seems to me. I think there's a way of saying the doctrine is still professed, but it doesn't necessarily need to be imposed on the universal church. In other words, what I think that statement tries to do, and the 2003 dialogue statement does again, is to say to people, we can understand why the West brought this in, and we don't need to continually recite it. It's not an admission of heresy to take it out. It's not an admission of heresy to leave it in. It seems to me the proper theological understanding here can account for both.
Okay. Patty asks, Father Zuger, a Byzantine priest, has written many books about the Orthodox collusion with the Soviets, while the Catholics were martyred in millions in old USSR. Do you have any thoughts about this?
It's very clear that communism hated Christianity. It's very clear that it destroyed at least as many Orthodox churches and monasteries as Catholic and Baptist and Jewish synagogues and Islamic mosques. I do not want people to get into kind of a competition about who has more martyrs or whose martyrs suffered more. It's very clear that there was enormous destruction by a regime that was bound and determined to erect an officially atheistic state. That said, there does seem to be some evidence that in some cases there were arrangements between certain Orthodox and figures within the Soviet regime that thought they had an advantage to gain by suppressing Catholic churches. I was at a conference at the University of Vienna in 2016, and I'm just finished editing the proceedings for publication on what is known as the Pseudo-Sabor of 1946, which was a council, a so-called council in Lviv in Western Ukraine of Ukrainian Catholic clergy who at gunpoint voted to reunite themselves to the Russian Orthodox Church. So there are experiences like that I don't think historically we serve anyone well by denying. At the same time, though, as I say, it's clear that everyone was corrupted. And the damage done is truly ecumenical damage across the board to the Orthodox as well as to the Catholic churches.
And
okay.
I'd have a follow-up comment on that specific topic. Right before World War II, really the Nazi invasion, the Russian Orthodox Church went from thousands of churches to something like 300.
Exactly.
Thousands upon thousands of priests until less than 1,000. I think we're talking hundreds.
Yep.
I think there were 2 bishops left. I mean, 2.
Yep.
So really, it was less of a anti-Union policy. There was an anti-Ukrainian policy. At that time, Ukraine was still, ever since really the Nazis, was still an uprising against the Soviet Union. And they happened to be in Galicia, which is near Poland, and in Western Ukraine. And so we have to interpret these things as Russia pretty much still fighting the Second World War. So let's put the shoe on the other foot. The Nazis, I mean, they totally devastated the church in Poland. They totally devastated the Orthodox Church in Serbia. Yet they were way pro the Orthodox Church in Russia and Belarus because it's a way of destabilizing the communists. And there's actually I think it's called The Priest, a great Russian movie that's subtitled. I recommend people here watch it because it'll give them some of that context. So it'd be more accurate, like Dr. DeVille is saying, to interpret these things as something that's really atheistic political policies where the only goal is to smash opposition. Not really the Orthodox think this or Roman Catholics think that, because there were opportunists in both, among the Roman Catholics and Orthodox siding with the Nazis or with the Soviet Union, or feeling this is the only choice they had to even keep the faith alive. So it went all around, and it really, though, the the egregious things had to do with atheism, not with Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism.
It looks like Ian asks, what are your thoughts on the Ravenna and Chieti documents? Do you think that we can expect more breakthroughs like these in the future?
Yeah, I think both of those texts are really interesting and were significant milestones. It's unfortunate that the dialogue is again at a halt. Moscow has pulled out because its policy as of January of this year is not to cooperate or not to be a part of anything where the Ecumenical Patriarchate is involved because it's broken communion. So the Ecumenical Patriarchate, of course, is involved in the official dialogue, which means that Moscow is going to, suspend its participation. So I don't know what we're going to see next. It's going to be a while before that happens again. But both documents, I think, and I've written about them and published about them, I think, represented significant insights for the Catholic Church, especially, again, as a way of recovering or rediscovering different ways of exercising governance in the Church.
Okay. Another question is, in lieu of the interview that Reason and Theology had with Father Patrick Cardine, a Western Orthodox priest, on Tuesday, do you think that the Western Rite and Orthodoxy has potential for greater ecumenical dialogue and mutual understanding?
I'm not a fan of the Western Rite, to be honest. I had a conversation with Paul Meyendorff several years ago at a conference. He taught liturgy at St. Vlad's for many years. And he said Western Rite Orthodoxy is just unionism in reverse. And
that was one of the questions that I posed to him.
Yeah, I find it kind of hard to disagree with that. The other problem I have with it is that it kind of invents a history that I don't see any serious scholars subscribing to. This idea that, really up until whatever we want to pick, the Synod of Whitby, for example, the British Isles were suddenly Orthodox. Let's just deal with Orthodoxy as it is without inventing a past that never was. I understand the pastoral and the evangelical motives of the Western Rite. I'm not gonna say it shouldn't exist. I'm a pretty liberal person on things like this, in that I think, if it gets people in the Church and it aids their salvation, that's great. I say that to Eastern Catholics who still want to have the Rosary and Stations of the Cross. If people want to have the Western Rite in Orthodoxy, if these are legitimate liturgical and spiritual expressions that aid people unto salvation, that's glory to God. I have no problem with that. Where it becomes problematic, as I say, is if you want to kind of use that to rewrite history in a way that I just find impossible to take seriously.
Do you foresee the liturgical chaos in the Latin Church causing problems with serious ecumenical dialogue? Do you think other liturgical changes need to be made or reverted? Well, it kind of cuts off. Okay, let's see. Do you think other liturgical changes need to be changed, reverted, besides the Filioque?
Yeah, I do. I send probably on average maybe 100 students a year to an Orthodox liturgy. And I've been doing that for more than a decade now as a requirement for one of my courses on Eastern Christianity. And I have to tell you, especially the Catholic students who come back from that, they are just staggered by what they see. And more with each year, each generation, they really feel ripped off within the Roman Catholic Church when it comes to liturgy. And there's a kind of an open envy a lot of them express at what they find in the East. In terms of the nature of liturgy, in terms of the architecture of the church, the use of icons, the whole kind of sensory extravaganza that you get in Byzantine liturgy. So I think, if the churches continue to move closer together, this is an area that people aren't really talking about. But I think this is going to be a big question for people, because this is where it becomes real. Doctrine and what Pope said, what Patriarch, that's kind of abstract and most people don't care. But what do I encounter on a Sunday morning? That's where it gets real. And I think a lot of certainly younger Catholics feel like the East has a tremendous gift in, and I would agree with this, has a tremendous gift in what it's preserved in its liturgical tradition, and the West very much needs to learn from that. I think they're right.
Hmm. What is your view of the Cation schism and the reunion of Hormisdas impacting how we talk with the Eastern Orthodox and the papacy?
The which schism? Sorry.
The Cation schism. I want to say it was 5th century.
Yeah.
Acacian. I
Right.
pronounce
Yeah.
it Cation. I apologize. Yeah.
I haven't heard it as a question. I don't know.
Well, and then of course you have the reunion of Hormisdas, and this is where the East had to sign, basically a formula affirming papal supremacy. How do you think that maybe impacts our talk with the Eastern Orthodox?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if it does. I mean, I think certainly at the level of official dialogues anyway, I mean, I think there seems to be a kind of an implicit assumption that we're really there's kind of an unofficial or maybe unconscious cutoff, it seems to me, that says we're kind of looking at dialogue from the 20th century onward. I don't see, again, in terms of official dialogues, people really sort of re-debating past controversies like that. I mean, the Filioque is one example, but a lot of the other periods when we're in and out of communion with each other don't seem to really come up, because I think most people kind of assume that that's not something we're going to bring up again. It's not totally relevant.
I would have a follow-up comment on that particular issue. I do wonder, because I don't know enough about the scholarship and how it's came up in the last couple centuries, but that particular formula may be something that seems like a bigger deal to people, laymen debating on Facebook or something. I know Eric might hit the ceiling. But that has then really been historically within the church. I found it interesting. Among the Oriental Orthodox, they viewed that particular formula as really their point of break, but really not for its papal pronouncements as much as it condemned their saints. So it's interesting in our ecclesiological debate that if the formula Hormisdas was not more important, didn't come up in Florence. So, why wasn't this something that came up if it was so important? Sometimes these things kind of gain importance in hindsight compared to what they've otherwise been historically viewed.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think you're right. Yeah.
I have a final question. So, okay, we still see that there's this clear schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Where do we go from here, in your estimation?
Yeah. It's a really funny situation. I just finished a paper today for a conference in Greece next month. It's a really funny situation we're in, because the question I've been asking in all seriousness is, since when has there been a halfway house to unity? After 1965, with the mutual lifting by Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras of the excommunications, where are we? Plainly, manifestly, de facto, we're not in restored Eucharistic communion with each other. And yet, if our hierarchs can come together at various feasts and recite the creed together, and if we've lifted any excommunication, which I don't think was ever supposed to apply to the whole church anyway, but where are we? It's a really odd kind of situation we're in. I have to say, I've really moved on this issue, because up until recently, I had no problem subscribing to kind of the traditional conservative mainstream position of both churches today, which is, there's still outstanding issues. We've got to resolve them, and then we celebrate the Eucharist together. I have to think, it's people on the Orthodox side who've really forced me to kind of take a second look at that. Lev Gillet, Antoine Arjakovsky, Michael Plekon, Radu Bordiano, even Dumitru Staniloia a little bit, to say, maybe we have to think about just going ahead and where people are willing, celebrating the Eucharist together. If we're going to wait for everything to be resolved, first of all, what does that mean? And how long do we have to wait for that? So I don't know. I don't know where we are. We're not united, which is where we should be. That's obvious to everybody. Where do we go from here? I would like us to continue to find ways, particularly at the local level, to be drawing ever closer to each other. I have no problem. I mean, officially, the Catholic Church has no problem with Orthodox Christians receiving communion already. I know the Orthodox tend to be much more conservative on this, at least at the level of official pronouncements. Practice is a different story. To my mind, if people are willing to go ahead and celebrate the Eucharist together today, I would have no problem with that. I know that's a minority view, but that's where I'm at.
Well, I actually know a few Eastern Catholic priests who can celebrate with Eastern Orthodox priests, and there doesn't seem to be any uproar about it. So I think that is kind of going on already at the local level. Don't know how legitimate that might be, but it's definitely happening. Craig, did you have any final questions?
Yeah, I kind of feel bad asking it because it takes us off probably the best way we could have ended it. But what would Dr. DeVille, what would your reflections be of the church in Ukraine, particularly among the Byzantine Catholics at this point? Because from what I could tell, it's very hyper nationalistic, and even I forget if he's a metropolitan, but their bishop, their key bishop, will say these very nationalistic statements. How would you describe at least European Ukrainian Catholicism compared to what you see in the West?
Yeah, I was at Seton Hall last month, gave a paper. It was a conference on Ukrainian Christian nationalism. Again, I think reading sources directly is really important. Because so much of what comes through Western media, even Western Catholic media, the Tablet, for example, out of London, tends to portray Ukrainian Christians, both Catholic and Orthodox, I think, in a pretty hostile light. And the kind of the hyper-nationalism you just mentioned is the standard portrait that I've seen in a lot of contemporary Western press. I don't think it's matched by what I'm seeing and hearing on the ground in Ukraine. There was a pastoral letter in January of this year from Archbishop Sviatoslav, who's the primate of the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, on the whole issue of nationalism in light of the new grant of autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That letter, I think, is a significant shift in the whole discourse of Ukrainian Christian nationalism in the post-Soviet period. To my mind, it's a much more nuanced, much more careful statement than even what we were hearing in the 90s, when I think there was a stronger nationalist element to it. But even there, I have to say, it seems to me sometimes there's a bit of a double standard that nationalism is much more sharply critiqued when it's coming out of a place like Ukraine than other places. And I'm not sure that's entirely fair, especially when I think if we try to get inside a Ukrainian mind, to recognize that this is a country that has never really existed before. I mean, there's a short-lived West Ukrainian Republic in 1920, and it's lived up against the Russian behemoth, who's made its designs on Ukraine very clear. As a kind of recovery of the Russian Empire. So I think if there is a bit of a nationalist element there, I think it's a defensive nationalism. I'm not a fan of nationalism. I mean, I've been very strongly critical of it for a long time. But I am sympathetic to parts of Ukrainian nationalist projects because I think the history helps us understand what Ukrainians are afraid of. And as I say, I think contemporary expressions of it on the part of Catholic and Orthodox hierarchs that I've read, it's much more nuanced. It's not, the exclusive kind of xenophobic nationalism that, we saw in the 90s.
Now, and one maybe on the lighter side, it's a small Ukrainian Catholic world. I know you're in Canada, I'm in the United States. do you know anything about the very large Ukrainian Catholic Church we have in Syracuse? I mean, it's as large as the cathedral that the Latin Rite has. And you have any comments on that church? And just
I grew up in Canada, but I'm here in Indiana. I've been here for 12 years. The church in Syracuse is the home church, if I'm not mistaken, of the incoming metropolitan for Ukrainian Catholics in the United States, a man by the name of Boris Gudziak, who's going to be installed in early June. He's a wonderful man, and I rarely say that about most Catholic bishops today, frankly. And Syracuse, I think, is his home parish. So it's been a kind of a major parish in Western New York for a while. And he comes out of that parish. In fact, he just went back, I think, last year to bury his mother from that parish. So that's about what I know of. It's produced a really fine man in Gudziak, who's also actually an accomplished scholar with a doctorate in history from Harvard. So that's kind of what I know about the parish.
Cool.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. So thank you, Dr. DeVille, for coming on. We really enjoyed it and appreciate your time.
And anytime.
Yes, sir. Hope to be able to do it again. Viewers, comment, like, subscribe. Dustin Quick, you won the competition that we put out yesterday on Craig's video. Basically the competition was send me a screenshot of you sharing the video, and the fifth person to do so will win. So Dustin Quick, I'll be sending you your free book. I believe it was Frank Sheed, Theology and Sanity. Another milestone to note is we just had 250 subscribers. So thank you all for subscribing and watching, and please keep sharing. And until next time, God bless you all.
Okay, thank you.